lot of books and peer-reviewed articles in the areas of transition, how to transition towards sustainability, making sense of contemporary food politics, and strategies for sustainable development. But in addition to being an academic, he is also a practitioner in that he's been chair of the Cork Food Policy Council, which he helped to establish in 2013. So he's actively engaged in the community. Now, in his bio, Colin Sage states, "I'm strongly committed to developing transdisciplinary conversations around ways of addressing contemporary environmental challenges." Now, this is a very good occasion for us at the university to continue this transdisciplinary conversation, because tonight, Colin, there are students from the business department, students who are in marketing, in food studies, in management, and in Italian studies. So we have all these rich backgrounds. So in fact, this gives us an opportunity as a university to think about the food systems, food and the environment from a transdisciplinary perspective. So we are all concerned by it. Thank you very much, Colin, for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for turning out in such great numbers this evening for what is going to be a thoroughly depressing talk. I don't know if you were brought to, here on false pretenses to make it believe that there was going to be something encouraging out of this. I don't think there is. But what we are going to do is to try and grapple with some challenges that we face, and those few moments we had before the introduction. You saw the climate clock counting down, counting up the tons of carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere, and counting down the time left that we have remaining before we breach the boundary of probably 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I'm assuming, given the diversity of your backgrounds, not all of you will be familiar with atmospheric physics and what all of this might mean. And you'll be pleased to know that I don't intend to start helping you understand this this evening, because the science is complex, but let's be absolutely clear that the science is also completely consensual, with one or two renegades, around the issue of climate change. So if you have come under the belief that we are heading into another ice age and that we don't really need to worry, you could probably head for the exits now, because the science is very clear about where we stand in relation to human-induced climate change, which you might know as global warming. I'll be talking about climate change. We should probably talk about climate disruption or climate breakdown, which is probably, more appropriate for the pace of change that is taking place. We could talk about global heating rather than warming. Warming is something that we feel accustomed to, we enjoy, but heating is something which is rather out of our control. And that's where we are. We're in a rapidly changing global climate, which is getting warmer by the day, because by the day we continue to emit greenhouse gases, principally from fossil fuels into the atmosphere. But obviously tonight I want to talk to you about the food system and about the contribution that food and agriculture makes to that process. Now I have to say, this is not a definitive, this is a first cut through this work. And there may be bits when I stumble over some of the figures. But like all good students, I provided a bibliography at the end, right? So if you need to check my sources, you're happy to scribble down some of those things afterwards and go and look at them. So what we'll do is proceed via Greta Thunberg, who you should know about, probably the most influential person on the planet right at this moment, 16 years of age, began that climate strike herself in Sweden, and 3 weeks ago this Friday, was responsible for getting 1.5 million children from school onto the streets all around the world. and including, I'm pleased to say, 5,000 of us in Cork, mostly children, but there were a few hangers-on like myself, and really bringing to bear an understanding that this is something that is most going to impact on their generation more than it is on mine. It's going to impact more my children, and if they were to be born, my grandchildren rather than myself. And that is what we have to understand. There's a transgenerational dimension to this, which our politicians across the world have failed to grasp. There are other dimensions to this that we'll discuss as we go forward. So really, the question of thinking about pathways forward is something that we need all to be engaged in. Some of them will offer more technical solutions, but many will involve, if there's any chance at all of us being in any way remotely successful in making this transition to 1.5 degrees, will involve popular movements, it will involve civic engagement, civic initiatives, and so on. I should just say 1.5 degrees, why 1.5 degrees? I should say that that's because the Paris Agreement, it was made in December 2015. It came out of the Conference of the Parties 21 meeting in Paris just over 3 years ago, agreed that countries should endeavour to limit warming to 2 degrees, and preferably perhaps to 1.5. Since that time, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, produced a report last October that said actually the difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees is absolutely phenomenal, and will involve, if the difference in terms of not necessarily human cost but economic cost of the order of $30 to $40 trillion of additional damage to infrastructure, to loss, and so on, if we were to allow ourselves to go towards 2 degrees. 1.5 degrees is not necessarily safe, but it's safer. And we're talking about a reference period, a period a reference standard, an additional 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that is taken from 1850 to 1900. So that's our baseline, as it were, prior to, I mean, already industrial revolution had started, obviously, even 100 years earlier, but that second half of the 19th century is regarded as a sort of baseline for which we have good temperature data and atmospheric composition data, and it's thought from that time we start to measure that additional climate or that additional warming. And you saw from the climate clock that we've already warmed by 1.07 degrees over and above the pre-industrial baseline. So we're hurtling, you could say, towards 1.5 degrees. And every day that we fail to take effective action is a day lost in doing that. And we'll look at some of the curves. I've got mostly, you'll be pleased to say, images. There's a few bullet points, but I'm trying to create as much sense of images, really. And this is our first one, to simply give some indication of the trend lines of this increased volume of annual emissions of carbon. And if you don't mind, I might speak, I will replace carbon dioxide equivalents, which brings in the other gases, like methane and nitrous oxide, which are especially important from agriculture, okay, especially important. So sometimes I'll use these terms, I'll substitute one or other, but effectively you can see this trend line, which isn't flattening out at all. In fact, we've been increasing over the last couple of years, increasing year on year our emissions. Much, of course, will reflect the state of the Chinese economy. Remember that the Chinese economy has effectively become the workshop of the world, and in doing so has been building coal plants, coal-fired electricity generating plants at a phenomenal rate. The Chinese really understand the challenge that we face, and it is also trying to decarbonize, having carbonized very heavily over the last 30 years. So it's now trying to reverse some of that process, not least because of air quality as well. And you see, we start talking about one environmental issue, we start ending up in another. And that's the nature of this business. It's extremely wicked. Not because it's naughty, but because these things are incredibly intricately intertwined. And that's what we have to understand, is how interconnected these issues are. But this trend line gives us an indication, is we're not slowing down our emissions, we're not flattening yet, and we have to, and with some degree of urgency. But we don't need to interrogate those figures very closely at this stage. What it means, if you like, let's get the take-home kind of picture out of the way. The thing that you might kind of remember is that if you lived in the Maldives and you were told that climate change was happening, perhaps global warming, translated into rising sea level, if the projected increase in sea level rise of something like 1.5 meters happens by 2100, this particular atoll will cease to exist. There's no way that you can defend this kind of facility, and this is what's happening in small island states across the Pacific, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the oceans. They're basically making arrangements now for exiting their homelands, their traditional places that they have been born and raised for generations. They're having to make arrangements now to find suitable sites where they can relocate themselves, to Australia, to New Zealand, and elsewhere. Andaman Islanders are busy negotiating with India to do that. So it may not affect us, especially if we live inland. If you live in a coastal city, there may be some issues happening about this, but if you live on a small island like this, then you are in for the likelihood of increasing inundation. And that's just from gradual sea level rise, but of course is accentuated at times of storm and so on. And Bangladesh, something like 80 million people live below the 1 meter contour in Bangladesh. So when you have the southwest monsoons and cyclones moving up through the Bay of Bengal, problems of flooding are likely to be accentuated, displacing more and more people for longer periods of time. This will all require emergency response, but it also needs building in as a resilient strategy. We'll come back to some of that. Another point of departure that I want to use here is this planetary boundaries idea, and this is quite an important metaphor for thinking about where we are. And the planetary boundaries idea has been around for the last 10 years. The work of the Stockholm Resilience Institute, led by Johan Holmberg, has been very important, or Rockström rather, Holmberg's another one, Rockström, and a series of authors, and they've been engaged in producing a series of reports and so on. This has become a kind of useful reference point to understand this era in which we are. You may have heard the term the Anthropocene, to describe this kind of era in which humans dominate the planet. And are creating the conditions that is taking us outside of the previous era that geologists know, because they're responsible for managing these different epochs and periods and eras and so on. And we're moving away from this period of the last 12,000 years called the Holocene into a much less stable environment, affecting all biomes around the world, right? Affecting us all in many different ways. But this planetary boundaries model makes it clear that through these ideas of these red zones that we are in very uncertain transgressive territory. We've exceeded some of these safe operating limits of this model. It's not altogether clear that we know where those limits are, I have to say. It's not altogether clear that we can put a simple figure upon where the green ends and the red carries on. And so that's where the science still continues to work away in trying to define more accurately some of those boundaries. For example, it's been suggested that 1.5 degrees we might need to limit atmospheric composition of CO2 to 450 to 480 parts per million. I wouldn't worry about that, just get a sense of the scale. Others argue that we're currently at 412, I should say, parts per million. 412 is the current figure. And so we have up until 450, you could say. But there are many scientists who say the safer limit is 350. which we said goodbye to years ago. So, you know, and we're already experiencing these climate effects. So in other words, there's quite a lot of still discussion around where do we put these safe limits. Last year I was here and I was speaking to the Italian Geographical Society actually around this particular sector, the nitrogen cycle, one that many we don't think about. It's almost entirely due to agriculture and to the nitrogen that we put on our fields, our nitrogen fertilizers. We won't even go there tonight because, you know, because we haven't got time. This is another area. You may have heard that we're going through what's currently being called the 6th Great Extinction. The greatest loss of life is going on right now since the age of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs ceased to exist, for whatever reason it was, you know, climatic changes, or people talking about these asteroids, that's right, flying in and changing the conditions. Well, whatever it did for the dinosaurs, we're now going through another huge period of biodiversity loss, and that doesn't just mean the charismatic megafauna, you know, that we like to think exists in our zoos. You know, it also exists. It represents some of the important, really critically important species for ecosystems, insects. And the pollinators, for example, the loss of the bee populations is a huge issue. It's concerning many, particularly in farming, and particularly if you grow fruit crops and you see a decline in pollinator numbers, it's very critical. So this is a big area. So we're going to be talking about this sector, but let's make it clear that all of these are closely intercoupled in very complex ways. So that's why we speak about, you know, these kinds of challenges being wicked, because they're very intricately interconnected. I should say, though, it's very important to say this isn't just an environmental problem. That if we are serious about addressing this predicament that we're in, it's not a question of discussing who's going to get into the lifeboat and who's going to be, you know, who's going to be lost at sea. It's going to be a question of how do we create a safe operating space for all of humanity. So this donut model developed by Kate Raworth doesn't just talk about an ecological ceiling or a planetary boundary, if you like. What are the outer limits that we're getting close to in terms of our different you know, physical parameters within the environment? But the question is the social foundations on which societies rest. Our need for basic living standards, basic living conditions, adequate, you know, access to food, drinking water, shelter, education, healthcare, all of those things that provide conditions of dignity for the human population for everywhere around the world. How are we going to ensure that those things are also provided? So in some ways, when we think about this safe and just space for humanity, it's a question that we'll have to think about significant redistribution. The kind of privileges that we all enjoy in this room, let's be clear, the reason we're here is that we have certain privileged access to some of those material goods, are denied 80%, 85% of the world's population. You know, what is it? A dozen men own, and they're all men, own the same amount of wealth as 50% of the world's population? We know who they are, and we're after you. But the question is, these kinds of forms of inequality are a major impediment to trying to, you know, redistribute and find ways of ensuring we do this. If there are large numbers of people you know, challenging the kind of structures of power, it's going to act as a major impediment to achieving these environmental objectives. So that's why it's better for us to think about finding more equitable solutions that begin this process of redistribution, and do that quickly. Do that quickly, so that, you know, we can all coexist on this planet, hopefully with whatever bits of nature remain after we've done with it. So when we talk about 1.5 or 2 degrees, this is our carbon curve. We can see carrying up, you know, in this way. We call this business as usual. the term, the acronym BAU, often you might see it around. So business as usual means that we carry on emitting carbon through our various kinds of activities. So we'll talk in a little while about lifestyle emissions, you know, which result from our collective and our individual activities. But this is the direction we need to go to if we are going to significantly reduce our carbon emissions. So if we're hoping to achieve or stay within a 1.5 degree ceiling, as it were, then we have to achieve zero emissions, net emissions of carbon by 2040. In case you didn't know, that's 20 years' time. And that's really very, very significant kind of threshold. We have very little extra time if we think 2 degrees is something that we can only afford to stay within. If we don't do that, we're heading to 3, 4 or more degrees of heating, which, well, the World Bank has already described 4 degrees as food and water fights everywhere. I mean, the World Bank, that wasn't me, that wasn't Greenpeace. Wasn't the World Wildlife Fund already reckons 4 degrees, there will be wars breaking out all over in terms of the struggle for resources. And it won't be mineral deposits, it will be land to grow food, you know, where it's still possible to grow food, and water resources. So those kind of alternatives, you know, make Mad Max look like some, you know, kind of children's kind of film. It doesn't bear thinking about. We really have to start, you know, exploring the realities of this. Now, you can see here, there are kind of traditional what's called mitigation technologies. The other thing which is, of course, often being suggested as our get out of jail card is carbon sequestration. And so you may have heard of carbon capture and sequestration. Essentially, large vacuum cleaners that are basically sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere and finding ways of solidifying it and then burying it back where that carbon originally came from, in the oil wells, in the coal mines, you know, and so on, in the shale gas seams and so on underground. I have to say that based upon my current reading and recent reading, nobody has yet managed to do any CCS, carbon capture and storage, at scale. It's still very much a technology in progress, and there's no prospect of that coming to the rescue like the US cavalry over the hill, you know, within the next 20 years. Now, it may have a contribution to make in 20 years' time or 30 years' time, but it's not going to be around soon enough for us not to address this question of lifestyle emissions and what we do about that. So that's just in case you were fastening on to some kind of belief that, oh, no, we can still make it, we can still make it. We can't. Give up hope now, and then once we've done that, then we can build from another place of reality, I think, is the thing where we're going. So look, there are some good technologies in play. We know offshore wind has the capacity to generate significant volumes of electricity at scale and more consistently than onshore wind energy can do. And we know that solar photovoltaics, you know, this is not just about domestic heating of domestic water systems. Turning sunlight into electricity is also being rolled out now at scale. Governments haven't yet got their heads around a mechanism to effectively pay householders. I mean, in Germany it's being done effectively, but most other countries are still grappling with this idea of feed-in tariffs. Feed-in tariffs is the mechanism by which you pay, you know, householders to put up an array of solar photovoltaic panels on their roofs, excuse me, and then to, you know, export that electricity into the grid. Now, there are grid issues, of course. There are some technical challenges to overcome. But nevertheless, it's an issue that can be managed. And so grid connections and so on, finding ways of driving the meter back the other way. You know, the electricity meter in your house, that, you know, that basically tells you how much you're using. Well, the idea is to reverse that and export electricity to the grid and make money out of that process. That's what we have to find better ways of doing. But these These fellas are already in mass production. Surprise, surprise, many of them are coming from China. The other thing, of course, is the electrification of the vehicle fleet. Again, this is an issue. We have to decarbonize our transportation system. Transport generally is a significant contributor alongside food and agriculture to our carbon emissions. Now, what we'll be talking about is a modal shift in the ways that we think about food and agriculture and transportation. I have to say, one of the big problems we have is not cars, although they're a big enough problem. It's actually flights. It's actually air travel. And we've all come here on an airplane. And we have a major problem in thinking about air travel, because that's one of the huge growth areas. Indeed, I've seen that Ryanair has just made it into the top 10 of biggest carbon emissions polluters in Europe in the latest round. And that's because, you know, the prospect of cheap air travel, the idea of being able to pop over to Barcelona for a long weekend, and all of this, we're all sucked into that kind of into that model. That is going to have to change, and we're going to have to rethink air travel. But mobility inside cities and countries as well is an issue. And frankly, I think the idea of electrification is very important. But again, it requires us to be much more imaginative about our transportation within cities. And it may well be that we should be thinking about electrification of bus fleets and insisting upon public transport as the primary means by which people move around outside of the use of bicycles. So those are the kind of dramatic changes. You mean I won't be able to drive wherever I want in my own car, powered by diesel? That's right, that's the reality. But worse is to come, so hold yourselves ready. So these are the kind of issues, but this is the low-hanging fruit. This is what we can do. This technology is already in play. So we can already make some good progress in this regard. There are other areas that are much more complicated. And this is one of them, right? The production of beef at scale in order that you can buy a hamburger for €1 or whatever else it costs is a question that is really challenging us now. Beef, well, ruminants generally, but beef are one of the biggest single problems that we have in respect to the environment. And there's been a whole slew of reports published over the last 10 years, one after another has been pointing the finger at beef. And of course, beef farmers feel like they're getting hammered, and they are. And the fact of the matter is that most beef farmers have been, you know, raising cattle. Well, in some cases, those farmers, because there is nothing else they can possibly do, the resources that are available to them makes actually grazing livestock extensively over rangeland perhaps one of the most effective ecological, you know, ways of managing that land. It's not suitable for growing crops. But there are other things, you know, that will have to replace beef cattle, and particularly the whole rise of feedlot beef, in order to drive down the cost of creating cheap meat, is a major issue. And I won't provide you with the figures, but can do if you're interested, but across every single criteria, environmental criteria, whether it's methane emissions, because the digestive system of cattle generate large amounts of methane from the feed, whether it's water use, whether it's their feed conversion ratios, land use occupied by cattle, and so on and so forth. Wherever you look, they're a disaster for the planet under our current circumstances. They may not have been for the population of, you know, 5 million people living in, you know, spread widely across rangelands in the past. But right now, with a population of 7.5 billion people and growing towards 10 billion people by certainly 2050, you know, meat is becoming an issue that we can't, it's becoming a luxury it will no longer be able to support. But we'll come back to that and look at some of the issues around that later. So, just quickly around some of the contributions by sector, this is our problem here. This doesn't mean that that accounts for every single part of the food chain. It clearly concerns land use change, removal of forests, and sequestration by forests. Of course, if we plant new trees, we're taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, but on the whole, we've been engaged in a massive deforestation exercise converting land towards either growing more grass or grain or rangeland for cattle or crops like feedstuffs. But it doesn't take account of all of the food moving through the food chain and so on, which is obviously accounting for part of the transportation sector. But you can see, you know, it's significant in terms of the way that these are, and they need addressing across the board. So one of the issues that we have is this rising appetite for meat. Again, I won't drill into this in much detail, but this is a universal thing. And it's part of what we've been calling this nutrition transition, this process of dietary change that's happened around the world. And, you know, in the United States, people have been accustomed to eating meat, a lot of meat, for a very long period of time. This is not a recent phenomenon. The East Coast seaboard cities were supported from the stockyards of Chicago from the late 19th century. There's been a long tradition of raising beef on the plains and bringing it into the seaboard eastern seaboard cities. You know, people ate a lot of meat over a long period of time, and you can see there's been a rather gradual growth in meat, a pretty static growth in meat consumption. In Europe, we've sort of stabilised meat consumption. Again, for every new person that has an appetite for burgers and so on, there's somebody else deciding that they prefer to go vegetarian. So again, stabilising there. The really interesting experience here is China, this blue line. And what we've seen is a very rapid increase in Chinese consumption. Because as incomes have risen in China, as elsewhere in the world, those rising incomes are translated into increasing consumption of higher protein feedstuffs, and most especially dairy and meat. Dairy is an interesting factor. I'm going to speak more specifically about meat, but the whole expansion of milk as a feedstuff in China has been remarkable. And the Chinese government has really pushed milk consumption for the last 20 or 30 years in a very significant way, bringing in lots of feedstuffs to support this expanding dairy cattle population, and also working a lot with other suppliers of dairy product. But meat as well. China now accounts for half the world's pigs. So pork is an extremely important foodstuff in China. Beef is too, but and so is poultry. But you know, there's a significant issue with pigs. Pigs and poultry, which are really, they're not being reared in people's backyards much anymore. They're intensively grown in feedlot conditions, what's called confined animal feeding operations. And those require feedstuffs to come in at great volume. Great volume. And I suppose, in some ways, if I was to do this talk again, I might avoid doing this, but I've just been taken up by an article I read in Nature, the science publication. And what I wanted to do was to say something about this idea of feeding animals, and the implications about all of this and what this might mean. And this may be of interest, probably the only bit of interest, to the business studies students, or you know, those of you doing international relations or whatever, because there are some implications here. But feeding animals, and it's not like in Ireland where we still put cows on grass. Most animals are being fed intensively through feedstuffs, which are being farmed and produced elsewhere. So feeding animals results in, and because of the growing numbers of animals, something up to about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So a very significant part of the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Something like 70% of all agricultural land is used to support the rearing of animals. Think about that. 70% of all agricultural land. Now that includes land that would otherwise couldn't be used for anything else, pasture land. But it also includes prime farmland, which is used for farming, for growing cereals and oil crops, which are processed into animal feedstuffs. And that's because we have an estimated 70 billion animals being reared every year. 70 billion animals. I mean, this is pretty extraordinary stuff. And 50 billion of those, I should say, are poultry, or chickens. Indeed, the collective biomass of farmed animals far exceeds the total estimated volume of biomass of wild animals in the world. All sorts of animals in the world, from insects all the way through to African elephants. So nature is being overwhelmed by what we're doing in our farm factories. Methane emissions, as I say, very significant in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's been argued that livestock occupy a fairly significant portion of this safe operating space, however we define it, of the planet, has direct consequences not only on climate change, but on these biogeochemical flows, this nitrogen issue, remember that particular sector, and biodiversity. The World Wildlife Fund actually attributes 60% of biodiversity loss to rearing animals and therefore to meat consumption. 40% of the global arable land used to produce arable feeds, animal feeds. 25% of that animal feed market is soybeans. And it's that which is, I think, particularly interesting because soybeans, remarkable crop produced for a staple of the culinary traditions of China and India. Fermented and processed and used in lots of novel ways and so on to produce foods that can be consumed directly by humans. But the vast majority of soy, which is farmed today, is used to produce animal feed. And as a consequence, the average European eating a meat-based diet is eating something like about 61 kilograms of soybeans a year, actually through the bodies of animals which are being fed that quantity of soybeans so that they can be reared. And you had no idea, well, many of you aren't Europeans, but you're eating European food at the moment, and you probably hadn't realized that you had so much soybean rattling through you indirectly. And that's because soy is critical to poultry, to pigs, and also to farm fish, to salmon and so on. So the soy frontier in South America is an issue. Some of the most important remaining forest that's left on planet Earth is in the heart of South America, Amazonia, and this is being lost at a phenomenal rate. And it has to say that the rate of deforestation in Brazil, particularly, has only been increasing since the election last year of President Bolsonaro. And so this Nature article that I was reading, which really, blew me away and revealed just how vulnerable we are to the kinds of things that emerge in the political space. And it began to work through this trade dispute between President Trump and the Chinese. And you've probably been aware that President Trump has an issue at the moment with the Chinese. You possibly might not, I don't know, but there is an ongoing trade dispute around tariffs. And maybe justifiably, a sense in which there's a trade imbalance and President Trump would like to find ways of balancing that trade. But this is interesting in the context of China, not only because it's significantly important in relation to its meat consumption, but its demand for soybeans in order to feed half the world's pigs. So it imports huge volumes of soya. It actually, of course, produces soya, but its production of soya has been declining for years because it's cheaper to source its soya from the other side of the world, from Brazil, from the United States, and so on, and other places. So this tariff row, even though it only broke out in the middle of last year, actually caused a 50% fall in US soy exports to China. And what has happened is that Brazil has stepped forward to fill the gap and continues to want to do that. So its own huge production taking place in the Sertão, as well as Amazonia proper, has been really expanding. And much of that is going into animal feedstuffs. And you can see just over that 16-year period, a 2,000% increase in Brazilian exports to China of soybeans. So it's been growing at a phenomenal rate. Now the question is, if this significant volume of exports from the US falls foul of this trade dispute, it's quite likely that much of this may end up being covered by Brazil, resulting in further deforestation. So what I'm trying to pin down here, and this may be a step too far, and I may have overcomplicated it by adding this in, is that we have to be alert to things that suddenly occur, these kind of what are sometimes called black swan events. they're outside of the environmental space. No one have immediately foreseen that some kind of trade dispute between the US and China was going to have these implications for environmental resources in South America. But that's what's happening. So these black swan events, as it's being described, you know, unexpected, but could have dramatic consequences. And as it reminds us, domestic production in China has been declining over that period because the Chinese can source soy at much cheaper prices. And it doesn't occupy otherwise scarce land, and most especially scarce water, for which it doesn't have an awful abundance. Now, it could be that Argentina and other countries step up, but you can see they're way behind in terms of their production. So, in that respect, we've seen rising rates of deforestation, and we're likely to see increasing volumes of carbon emissions as a result of deforestation. You imagine moving through large areas of forest, cutting it down, perhaps taking out anything that's valuable, teak, mahogany, whatever, and then burning everything else. Huge amounts of carbon is released into the atmosphere, which accentuates our problem. And so the question, I suppose, is there a way that we can resolve this? There is a moratorium on soybeans. It's not supposed to involve the expansion of the frontier. But I also spent this week looking at drone footage coming in from both eastern or western Amazonia and Bolivia, which I was also going to use, and I thought, no, thank goodness I didn't. I decided not to. But this footage is, you know, huge. I mean, as far as the eye can possibly see, these are flat plains covered with soybeans. And this is the reality of this expanding frontier. Ultimately, the issue is we have to bring this back to the question of how do we feed our animals so that then we can eat cheap meat. And that's the connection that we fail to think about. Nobody's been thinking about that. Not you, not even many of the specialists, the scientists. So this has to come back into greater public visibility. And we have to rethink some of this. So that's where, I suppose, I'm looking forward this evening to think about bringing those connections. And this is the reality of the soybean frontier. Allocations of hundreds, thousands of hectares of land farmed in this way, not with any sympathy for nature, of course. And this is the outcome. So, as we move forward, in another 5 minutes or so, some signs were being prepared for me, to hurry up. So the issue is, how can we measure all of these various impacts? And of course, the issue, another report I was reading recently, produced by outfits in Finland and Japan and elsewhere, is all about saying, let's bring it back down to things like lifestyle carbon footprints. And you probably have an idea of what a footprint is. You know, it's the physical volume of land that we take up, and we can begin to think about those footprints in relation to meat and in relation to, you know, all sorts of transportation sector and everything else. But the issue is for the nutrition, thinking about what are the particular, you know, how do we calculate the various kinds of emission profiles that come from a particular society, and what kinds of levels of reductions are necessary. So this study from Aalto University in Finland had done, obviously, work on the Finnish economy and the Finnish society, and had identified that, you know, suggested that across the board, on average, there is about 1.75 tons of CO2 equivalent, call it carbon for in the interest of simplicity for the moment, per person, that is responsible for, just associated with nutrition. There are other contributions from mobility, from air travel in cars. Home heating, you can imagine, is significant in Finland because of the cold front, you know, area and so on. So there are lots of other contributions to this total footprint. But animal products, interestingly, they only make up 1/3 of the diet by volume, but they account for 78% of the carbon footprint. This is the disparity. When we think about meat compared to, you know, bread, or compared to vegetables and legumes and fruit and something, they're all contributory in some ways. But meat is by far and away the largest source of carbon in that respect. Meat intake, which is not excessive in Finland, very much in line with the rest of Europe, of 80 kilograms plus another 200 kilograms per person per year of dairy products, cheese, milk, and butter, and so on. Japan, slightly different nutrition dietary practices, of course, slightly lower meat consumption, comes in at 1.4 tons per person. So we can begin to start to see, you know, again, this is still probably above what we're able to accommodate in terms of our planetary limits. Again, we can see how that's made up. China, about a ton per person, for which meat accounts for nearly half the carbon footprint in the nutrition domain, okay, just in terms of what it, of that particular aspect. It's other parts of his lives, of people's lives there, contribute other elements. India. Now, India's very, very interesting here. India, as you can see, has half the per capita carbon footprint of China itself. And of course, what we know in India, there is lower levels of meat consumption because of cultural practices, higher levels of vegetarianism are practiced. Within a society, predominantly, not exclusively, it's Hindu, you know, there's greater attachment to animals. They are reconfigured in different ways in relation to that society. And it may well be that there are things about India and its practices that, from which we can learn, you know, just as a way of thinking about this. So where its biggest sources are from dairy and cereals in that regard. So, 1.5 degrees. How are we going to achieve the targets, keep ourselves down in relation to our carbon emissions, given the contribution that meat makes? How are we going to do that? Well, what it suggests is this report, this Finnish report that I was referring to, and many of these reports make different calculations, but they all come within the same baseline areas, suggesting that we have about 2.5 tonnes by 2030, 1.4 tonnes by 2040, and half of that again by 2050. And this is CO2 equivalents per capita per year. What that means, the bottom line is, in Finland and Japan, we're talking about cuts from present-day consumption practices and the emissions that result of over half by 2030, by 3/4 by 2050. So very significant ways that we have to start that process, that downward curve that you saw, and you can see that if we only have these kinds of targets, and we're already in excess there, not India, but everywhere else, is probably well above what is acceptable. So we have to engage in very immediate decarbonisation strategies in relation to food, and meat and dairy are the single biggest sources of where we can make some effort. I'm going to be brief on this topic, but it's kind of an interesting area. We should talk about it again on another opportunity. I might get tomorrow with the MA Food Studies students. But actually, alternative proteins are becoming the in thing. I was going to spend more time talking about this, but you know, we'll cover this another day. But there's a lot of excitement out there in Silicon Valley where much of this stuff is being developed in the area, less so of edible insects, but certainly plant-based proteins and what's being called cellular agriculture. This is about building new material from using tissue engineering from animal stem cells. So how can we create, you know, meat in the lab, effectively, which actually doesn't involve any involvement with animal bodies, in vitro kind of methods outside the body. And obviously research, the kind of promised land is this visceral experience. You want to replicate the experience of people biting into meat. You want the experience of eating meat, but without the guilt. I mean, most of you probably don't have any guilt when you eat a burger. You should. You should have some. But the point is that when you eat one of these other burgers, you won't have any guilt, and you'll feel the difference. So anyway, it's a complicated moral story, a moral journey there. But the thing is, are alternative proteins the breakthrough? Are alternative proteins the breakthrough? What we have to do, of course, as social scientists as well as natural scientists working in this space, is to think about the process of making food at the molecular scale. It's all about creating new material substances and then using other ways of signaling that as being an acceptable form of food stuff. Things become food as they pass through material processes and they pass through human practices. And there's a very kind of interesting literature, the work that was done by sociologist Mary Douglas about the creation of taboos and all of that around food, which, you know, is helpful in that regard. I have to say, as somebody who